Hello, everybody. It's Pastor Bill. Just wanted to present a easy way to outline the book of Revelation so it's a little more easy to understand, called the timeline in Revelation. Now, when we're talking about trying to organize Revelation, a lot of times people will do it thematically, and there's nothing wrong with this. So, some themes that people will try to organize Revelation around are the cycle of sevens. There's a few different cycles of sevens in the book of Revelation, so they'll try to make these match up and have them be the outline of the book. Another way is how Jesus is presented as a slain lamb or victorious king, and so or judge, and so people will organize it around the theme of how Jesus is presented, and also sanctuary festivals that are not always easily understood to be there, but they're there, and so some people will organize it around that. And there's other themes that people will organize the Book of Revelation around, and there's nothing wrong with this at all. I have found though that it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around Revelation if you're trying to organize it thematically. How it's been helpful for me is to organize it around a timeline. And so, what I mean by that is just the time periods that the book covers. What does the book discuss? What are the visions in there? What are they talking about these in the time period wise? And so that's what I just wanted to break down today. Hopefully, it will make it a lot easier for you to understand Revelation as well. So first of all, there is John, the apostle in the first century on the island of Patmos, and chapter 1 of Revelation opens up with kind of an introduction of how the book works, that he's going to receive visions, and there's going to be symbols in these visions, and then Jesus says, I need you to write to 7 churches. And so near the end of chapter 1 of Revelation, Jesus says to John, write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later. And so here we have a very simple timeline outline of the book of Revelation. First of all, write what you have seen. So in vision, John, there in the first century, I need you to write down what you've seen in vision. And the two categories are what is now. So what's happening right there in the first century, I want you to write what you see in vision that pertains to your day right now, and then also what will take place later. That is later after the first century. So in the future, from John's perspective of the first century. So the two time periods that we see in Revelation that are covered are the situation in John's time, there in the first century, and the future from the first century until eternity. That's what it covers the rest of the book. So when we look at the situation in John's time, specifically in chapters 2 and 3, in vision, God gives John messages to real churches that existed in John's day. So this is a picture or a drawing of a map of the churches that John would have written to. This is in modern-day Turkey, and there are 7 churches here. And so there were situations that were happening in those churches during the first century, and that needed to be addressed. And so Jesus gives John in vision the messages to these specific 7 churches. That's what's happening there in the first century. Now, I'm also aware that these messages can also apply to certain time periods of church history and also to our own hearts, because we can each have something happening in our hearts that pertains to each of these churches. These messages can apply to all of our lives, right? But overall, this is what's happening in John's day in the first century. So this is why I say chapters 2 and 3 are the situation in John's time. But then we see a little shift in chapter 4. So after those messages, John is given this vision of the heavenly throne room and is told to come up here and I will show you what must take place after this. And so when we're talking about after this, this is right after those messages to the 7 churches. And this would be to the future. So from the first century perspective of John towards the future, this is what he's about to be shown. So we have the 2 time periods again, the situation in John's time that chapters 2 and 3 cover, and then the future from the first century to eternity, which is chapters 4 through 22. That's the total future that John sees. And when we're looking at these chapters 4 and 5, for instance, they're really an introduction to that future. John goes up to the throne room and he sees Jesus, and he's represented as a slain lamb, talking about his death on the cross. And then Jesus receives a scroll, and it's sealed with 7 seals. And then beginning in chapter 6 all the way to the beginning of chapter 8, Jesus breaks open these 7 seals. And as this happens, time moves forward from the first century to the second coming. And so this is the time period that's covered by the opening of these 7 seals. The first century, which is John's day, all the way to the second coming. This is the future. And then what happens beginning there in chapter 8 is that there are 7 trumpets that are blown. And that stops at the end of chapter 11. And what we find, if you carefully study through this, again, it's the first century to the second coming. They're covering the same time period. So what we find right away after those brief introductory chapters in chapters 4 and 5, chapters 6 through 11 of Revelation are really just 2 different descriptions of the first century all the way to the second coming. And different things are highlighted, and we're not going to get into all that stuff because that would take a long time, obviously. Now, when we get to chapter 12 then, after those 2 cycles of the first century to the second coming, what we're finding, if you do some studying, it's the description of church history from the first century until, and I haven't finished the until because we would expect until the second coming. But in chapter 12, it doesn't get to the second coming. All it does is gets to the time of the end. That's the time period right before the second coming. And at the end of chapter 12, all it says is, then the dragon, that's Satan, was enraged at the woman, that's God's people, and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. We see this description that's going on, not of Jesus coming, but of what's setting up the time of the end, that Satan is after God's people and wants to destroy them. So when we get then to chapter 12, we shift the focus to the time period right before the second coming. And then, of course, in Revelation 13, then it begins to describe Satan's activities to deceive and coerce people to worship him. And it's interesting because then we get to Revelation chapter 14, and not only does it talk about what God's people are doing during this time to combat what Satan's deception is, but also that ends with the second coming. So we really have another cycle of first century to the second coming, but it takes 3 chapters. Then what we find is chapters 15 through 18 go into more detail about the time period of the end, right before the second coming, and breaks down really what Satan is really trying to do and assures us that God will have victory. And that kind of cycle ends with chapter 19, which is the final description of the second coming. So it's all kind of laid out there. And of course, after the second coming, chapters 20 through 22 are the time period that follows the second coming into eternity. So let's just do an overall timeline of Revelation as we end this little video. There's an introduction, as we said in chapter 1. Chapters 2 through 3 covers the first century. This is what John is seeing in his day. Chapters 4 through 11 are the first century to the second coming. These are the cycles of the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets. Chapter 12 through 14 really starts to dive into the time of the end and ends with the second coming. And then chapters 5 through 19, again, just like 12 through 14, is the time of the end to the second coming, breaking more information off so we won't be deceived at the time of the end by what Satan's trying to do. And then literally 20 through 22 is just after the second coming, just the time period following the second coming into eternity. So this I have found to be an easy way to organize the book of Revelation so I can understand it, and it helps put the context to what the visions are all about. Because unless we can wrap our minds around some sort of an outline of Revelation that makes sense for us and is biblically true, biblically accurate, then it's going to be very hard to understand Revelation. So I hope this helps. May God bless you as you're trying to continue to draw close to Him in understanding His Word, specifically this book of Revelation.